Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm excited to have Wilfredo Ocasio and Martha Kimber here with me today hosting the webinar. I'm Katie Breinig, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I'll let you know a little bit more about how this webinar will run. Today's webinar is being recorded. The slides and recording will be available for you within 3 business days. A short Q&A will follow the presentation to answer viewer-submitted questions. During the webinar, you can submit questions you have using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the Questions tab, type in your questions, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions throughout the webinar. That concludes my brief introduction today. Wilfredo, I will now pass the webinar off to you. You may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everyone to today's presentation. We're going to be talking about a subject very near and dear to me, which is acidified foods, and particularly the question related to whether your product is an acidified food or not. In terms of what the agenda presentation outline looks like, we're going to start by giving you some information, background information about the regulations, and again, related to this issue of classification of the products. And then my colleague, Martha Kimber, is gonna take over and talk to you about the microbiological risk associated with this product category, and including the issue of ambient fill processes. As we know, as we move a lot of these products from the exclusion from the acidified regulations into coverage under the acidified food regulations, a thermal process is required, and if you're not using a thermal process, then you have to move into a formulation control approach and have a challenge study, and we'll be talking about that as well. Starting with the regulations, is your product an acidified food? Well, let's start with the definitions and requirements under 21 CFR 114, which is the regulation that governs acidified foods, and also 21 CFR 108, which is the regulation that dictates that you file your process with FDA prior to start production of that product. So you have to provide this information to FDA and have their nod, if you will, before you start production. These products are not excluded from the FSMA regulation, so you also have to comply with 21 CFR 117, which is the CGMP, Current Good Manufacturing Practices, Health Analysis, and Risk-Based Preventive Controls for Human Foods under FSMA. If you're in California, you also have the California Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch. I'm located in California, so very familiar with this requirement. This is in addition to the federal requirements. So let's start with a definition of what we're talking about here today. An acidified food is defined under 21 CFR 114 as a low acid food to which acid or acid foods are added. They have a water activity greater than 0.85 and a finish equilibrium pH of 4.6 or below. One of the key issues with the definition and the subject of much confusion in terms of the classification of these products is the following statement. Acid foods that contain small amounts of low acid foods and have a resultant finish equilibrium pH that does not significantly differ from that of the predominant acid or acid food are excluded from this part. As I mentioned before, the regulations also require, and notice that this is a shall in the regulations, which means that is a requirement, a mandate to be thermally processed. Furthermore, it mentions that preservatives are permitted to inhibit the reproduction of microorganisms of non-health significant in lieu of thermal processing. So this opens the door a little bit to preclude the thermal process with a proper challenge study in lieu of a thermal process. So we know from a regulatory standpoint that these are shelf-stable products that contain low amounts of low acid components plus an acid or acid food. They must have an equilibrium pH of less than 4.6, water activity greater than 0.85, shall be thermally processed. The thermal process or equivalent also must address the container and the closure. It's not just the product, but the container and the closure as well. And the process must be filed with FDA prior to begin production. Preservatives may be used in lieu of a thermal process. And remember that these products are not exempted in any way from the requirements of the FSMA preventive control rule. Should also point out that these products have a great safety record. I've gone through trying to find records of outbreaks and so on, and there's very few instances where acidified products, if any at all, in the last couple of decades have been implicated with foodborne illness outbreaks. So what did we know before the conference, the International Association for Food Protection conference last week, where FDA spoke? We knew that products that were naturally acidic, refrigerated, frozen, alcoholic drinks were clearly exempted from the regulation. We knew that products that contain large low acid particles are clearly covered. These are things like pickles, cucumbers, in pickle production, peppers, onions, etc. The regulation calls out jams, jelly, carbonated beverages, dressing, condiment sauces, fermented as examples of product that may be excluded from the regulation, but watch out for the addition of low acid foods. They're not entirely excluded if they contain low acid foods. They still have to meet the threshold of the small amount of low acid components and the insignificant change in pH. So again, that statement that I just mentioned. In September of 2010, many of you will recall that there was a draft guidance document that the FDA put out, which created a lot of the confusion that happened in the following decade and change. That draft guidance document considered water as a low acid ingredient, hence moving a lot of products into the acidified category that were previously excluded. The FDA rescinded that draft document in December of 2015, yet that draft guidance is still around, and many inspectors, particularly state inspectors, acting on behalf of FDA, oftentimes conducting inspections at the plant level, are still following that guidance and deeming products to be acidified that perhaps should not be. We were told before the IFT conference last week that a new guidance was under development, but it has taken years. That guidance was supposed to address the water issue. We'll cover that in a few minutes here. The preventive control rule, again, applies to acidified foods. The cold fill hull option is available in lieu of a thermal process when supported by a challenge study. But at the time before the conference, our understanding was that only potassium sorbate and sodium benzoate could be used in the challenge study to support that. So during the conference, Dr. Glenn Black of FDA addressed this issue in particular in front of an audience, and he made it clear that there will be no guidance document for acidified foods. That idea of a guidance document coming out is being discarded. The guidance document, there will be a guidance document addressing the interaction between FSMA and low acid canned food rules. But that document will not address the acidified food classification issue that we're talking about here today. However, the big statement that he made that will please many within the industry is that the low acid canned food group will no longer consider water as a low acid ingredient. For products already filed, you must reach to the LACF group and request a clarification. So this is going to be tricky because I'm sure a lot of people are going to be knocking on their door, and Dr. Black made it clear that they understand that. And he also states that FDA is willing to assist with the classification. He also mentioned that other preservatives can be included in the challenge study, which is also good news. But besides this statements, there's very little that's going to be changing in the policy that FDA uses to evaluate and classify these products. He mentioned that a 5 log reduction is not an absolute requirement for the challenge study, but really compelling data must be submitted to lower this requirement. And I know that this is quite an undertaking based on previous experience from the Almond Board of California, for example. A lot of data has to be produced. So is it an acidified food? So we know that the concern about the regulation is grounded on the risk of Clostridium botulinum growing in these products. We know that the preamble to the rule focused on products that contain large particles and take a long time to equilibrate to reach that equilibrium pH. We propose, I was one of the co-authors in a recent publication where we're proposing that products that are that do not contain particulates and or reach equilibrium pH rapidly should not be considered acidified foods, but rather formulated acid foods and be excluded from the regulation. So in that publication, we put forth a very simple scheme to determine whether it's acid or acidified. Again, this is not something that is approved or agreed to by FDA by any means, but this is a proposal we think based on sound scientific approach that if the product contains a small amount of low acid foods and require a significant or does not require a significant amount of time to reach equilibrium, it should be considered an acid food. So this approach is a qualitative approach. I've also, during this conference, had a good discussion with Dr. Fred Bright, which is with USDA ARS. Is located at the North Carolina State Campus University. And he's developed a quantitative modeling tool to evaluate total buffering capacity in food ingredients. And Dr. Fred Bright has a lot of influence with the LACF group. The Acidified food groups have really followed Dr. Fred Bright recommendations for a long time. I'm talking about the FDA. So the fact that he's working on this approach that mimics the approach that we propose in the Food Protection Trends article, but using a more quantitative approach to determine the buffering capacity of these products and the time that it takes for the pH to change when ingredients are mixed together. This may allow a single number demarcation between acid and acidified foods by using the ratio of this buffering capacity ratio. So this is under development. Here are some of the publications that he's put out on this front, and more is coming, including the model itself is available on the USDA website, and information is there available. Again, this is not something that FDA is in line with yet, but it is pointing in the right direction. So what to do now? We suggest strongly that you work with your processing authority to assess the classification of this product. If the product is classified as a formulated acid food, obtaining a letter from the processing authorities scientifically justifying the decision, and this is the type of thing that we're talking about doing with Dr. Fred Bright and so on. And if classified as an acidified food and the food is cold-filled and is not thermally processed, work with a PA to design and execute an appropriate challenge study, which Martha is going to talk about here if I get off quickly. And then you also have the option of voluntarily submit the information to FDA, even if you think that the product is an acid food. And this voluntary filing under FDAs are for foods that the process, and this is right from the FDA website, this is on foods that the processor have determined are not subject to the regulation for acidified foods, but for which the processor has decided to voluntarily submit process information to facilitate FDA determination regarding the regulatory status of the foods. And with that, I'm going to pause briefly and ask Martha to take over.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Martha Kimber, and I've worked with Wilfredo for about 11 years now. Really quickly, I think we have a poll question. Is that right, Katie?
Yes, we do. All right, everyone, on your screen, you're going to see a quick poll question. Our question is, do you currently have products that may fall in the gray area of classification? If you could take a moment, I'll give everyone about 30 to 45 seconds to answer this yes or no question. All right, everyone, about 10 more seconds here. All right, the results from our poll was 58% yes and 42% no. And I will close this question here. All right, Martha, you can continue with your presentation.
All right, so part of what Wilfredo mentioned is that these acidified foods shall be thermally processed. And the goal of that thermal process is to inactivate vegetative pathogens capable of surviving and causing illness. Even if they're present at very low levels, these have a low infective dose, so they're still of concern. The other point of thermal processing is to make sure that your product is shelf stable by inactivating spoilage organisms that are capable of reproducing in the product under normal conditions. And then now we're going to talk about the microbiological safety of acidified food. So in general, we aren't too worried about spore-forming pathogenic organisms like Clostridium botulinum. And that's because they're inhibited by the acid content of the product. They can't grow below pH 4.6. However, vegetative pathogens such as E. coli 157H7, Salmonella, and Listeria monocytogenes, they may be present even if they can't grow. They can survive for pretty long periods of time in the product. And they do have that low infectious dose that I mentioned. So even if they're there a few cells, they can present a public health risk, even if they're not growing. Some common spoilage organisms of concern for this category include yeasts and molds, lactic acid bacteria, and there are some other odd organisms such as Alicyclobacillus and whatnot that can be present in exotic ingredients. Yeah, so some of these acidic heat-resistant organisms include heat-resistant molds and Alicyclobacillus. They can grow at a pH of below 4.0, but they're normally controlled by the use of quality ingredients and preservatives. Other spore-forming bacteria are noted, such as Bacillus subtilis and Bacillus licheniformis. And these are of concern because if they grow in the product, they can actually increase the pH. And so if you're increasing the pH above 4.6, all of a sudden you may be opening yourself up to issues with other spore-forming pathogens which can grow in the product. And really quickly, would you like to do another polling question?
For sure, I'll get that one launched here. All right, everyone, if you could please answer the quick poll question on your screen. Our question here for you is, do you currently have products or products that you know will require a challenge study to file with the FDA? This is another yes or no question, and I will give you another 30 to 45 seconds to answer this. All right, everyone, I'll give you about 10 more seconds here. All right, to our poll question, do you currently have a product or products you know will require a challenge study to file with the FDA? About 40% said yes, and about 60% said no. All right, Martha, that concludes your polling question. You can go ahead and continue with your presentation.
All right, so now we're going to talk about ambient fill process implications. So primarily we're going to talk about challenge studies required for ambient filled acidified foods. So this is a little bit confusing because the FDA terminology is cold fill, but actually which kind of implies that we're talking about refrigerated foods, but actually the idea is that you're talking about ambient fill, so room temperature. So that's just something to keep in mind. And there's two types of ambient cold fill processes that you might have. The first might be a product that is thermally processed, you know, kettle cook or HTST, whatnot. And then it's cooled down and ambient filled into the final packaging. So this does not include aseptic or hot filled products. The second type of ambient fill might be a product where you just combine the ingredients together without a thermal process, and then it's followed by an ambient fill. And this is common for dressings and preserved beverages, typically. And what is at stake here? So many products, such as dressings, sauces, flavored waters, are traditionally ambient filled. And when some of this guidance came out, they were reclassified as acidified foods. It's really difficult to reconfigure a lot of the processes for these products to introduce a hot fill or other alternative process. And many of these products are packaged in lightweight plastic bottles, such as PET, which cannot withstand high hot fill temperatures. So is the thermal process of a product always necessary? And no, it's not. Actually, that's not necessary to assure microbiological safety, and it's not really the intent of the regulation. There is another path. The Form 2541E is the cold fill and hold process form. And the idea with this approach is that you're using the product formulation's intrinsic parameters, which may include pH, titratable acidity, preservative levels. And you're using those intrinsic parameters to achieve microbial lethality against pertinent vegetative pathogens. So this is a formulation control approach that Wilfredo alluded to earlier. The efficacy of the formulation to deliver the lethality must be scientifically validated. And the way this is usually defined is the amount of time required to achieve a 5-log reduction. And the challenge study that you are referring to for your cold fill and hold process should be attached to your filing form. So here are two papers that we refer to quite a bit. They're just on my desktop all the time. And the first is written by Dr. Fred Bright and his team. and it's recommendations for designing and conducting cold fill hold challenge studies for acidified food products. He gives very detailed recommendations for how you set up these studies, which we can go into more detail in the next slides. And also, we always keep in mind for all of our studies would be the parameters for determining inoculated pack challenge study protocols, which is put forth by the National Advisory Committee of Microbiological Criteria for Foods, or NACMAF. So that's a mouthful, but it's a really, really important paper for our group. We try to use the recommendations to make sure that our study designs are robust. So some design considerations. Again, the design must be scientifically sound. We would like to always use a representative product formulation to select for the study. And it's impractical if you have, multiple SKUs or formulations, you would want to test a representative formulation. Often we try to pick the worst case scenario for each product category. And the way that we determine worst case scenario is we look at the formulation parameters. So the pH, the titratable acidity, salt, preservatives, etc. And we identify which ones we think are worst case for each category. And then for the actual test, we'll adjust the formulation to the minimal values or the worst case scenario for that product. So for example, if your product has a pH range of 3.4 to 3.6, we would want to test a product that's slightly on the higher end, maybe at 3.6 or 3.7, just slightly above, so that we know that what we're testing is going to cover all production for your product moving forward. Other design considerations include selecting pertinent organisms. In this guidance, they recommend using E. coli 157H7, Listeria monocytogenes, and Salmonella. We try to select strains that are associated with cases or outbreaks on the given product. So for example, if your product includes fruit or vegetable juices, we would like to include the Odwalla E. coli 157H7 strain from the outbreak. That's just an example of a strain that we'd like to include because it's so important for that category. It also includes that all 3 pathogens must be tested, and the pathogens must be tested separately. So if you come to a lab and they want to combine E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria together in one cocktail, that's not the best way to do it. We actually do multi-strain cocktails of E. coli, so 4 to 5 strains of E. coli, 4 to 5 strains of Listeria in a separate cocktail, and then 4 to 5 strains of Salmonella in a third cocktail. Another thing that Fred Bright calls out in that publication is that it's really important that you acid adapt your cultures prior to inoculation. So I've seen some people try to force fit a USP type study where you're inoculating the product with all these different bugs and then looking for reduction. But a lot of those USP methods, they don't acid adapt. So that's not going to necessarily be the best data for the filing. Another consideration is that the inoculum level must be high enough to allow for a 5-log reduction quantification. So if there's background organisms, we might give a mild thermal process. Another approach is if there's background organisms in the product, we might use a non-selective media with a selective overlay, which is referring to this paper by Wu et al. So it's just making sure that, so for example, with Salmonella, if it's injured and you're recovering it on a selective media, such as XLD, you might get 1 to 2 log lower count than if you're recovering it on a non-selective media, such as tryptic soy agar. So that's something you want to be really thoughtful about with your methodology. And one of the really big points is that the incubation temperature for your study should be the lowest expected condition during warehousing. So for most of these shelf-stable acidified food products, the warehouse temperature is not controlled. So in the winter, it could get down as cold as 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So you want to be really mindful of including that colder temperature in your study design. And that's because these organisms die off more slowly at cooler temperatures and faster at warmer temperatures. So if you want to really know what your worst case scenario is, you need to include that cooler temperature. Also, the length of incubation, you want to make sure that it's aligned with what you can reasonably do in terms of warehousing at your facility prior to release. So most people can't hold a product for several weeks in their warehouse. So we try to design the study so that it's short enough for what you can reasonably do. So more on the order of several days. So the first thing that everyone asks me when we start these studies is, Martha, how long is it going to take for my bugs to die off? And I just wanted to throw up a comparison of some of these studies that we've done to show that it can be very different and it's very product dependent. So all three of these are beverages with a pH of 3.1 to 3.2. The first one, we see everything die off in 3 days. This is a beverage with water, citric acid flavors, sorbate, benzoate, complete die off in 3 days. The second one is a flavored beverage that includes fruit juice and ascorbic acid, no preservatives. We see complete die off in 7 days. However, salmonella is the one that's lingering longer than the other two organism groups. And then in the third example, it's an energy drink that has fruit juice, citric acid, sorbate, and benzoate. And in this case, it takes 14 days for E. coli 157H7 to finally get to that 5 log reduction. So all I wanted to illustrate here is that this is very product dependent. Even at the same pH, if you have a different acid composition, you can get different results. Here's another case study with some sauces and dressings. So the first one is a very typical condiment type sauce at a pH of 4.4. It includes some low acid ingredients like onion and garlic, and it has soy sauce, phosphoric acid, and preservatives. For this product, the pH is pretty high, so at a pH of 4.4, but we did see 5 log reductions occur in 6 days. And for this product, the E. coli was the one that survived the longest. Now, in the second example, it's a dairy-based dressing with a pH of 4.0. And in this case, we saw that Listeria was the one that survived slightly longer than the other two organisms. However, we did see die off in 3 days. So again, these bugs all have different rates of die off and different product compositions. All right, so now you have your product classified, you've done your challenge study, and now you're all ready to submit your filing with the FDA. Here's just an overview of what you'll need to do. First, you'll need your processing facility registration, so your FCE number, and you'll use Form 2541. You'll also need Form 2451 for 2451E for the acidified food process filing. You'll need your process authority letter, which relates to your thermal process if it's applicable. And you need to make sure that the letter describes the thermal process time and temperature. And if it's an ambient filled product, you'll need to have a challenge study final report, which clearly states the intrinsic parameters. So that would be the product maximum pH, minimum titratable acidity, minimum preservatives, etc., as well as the extrinsic parameters that are going to achieve that kill. So that would be the minimum time required to achieve 5 log reductions of all 3 of those pathogens, as well as the minimum holding temperature that you conducted the study at. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for listening to our presentation.
All right, thank you everyone for the presentation. Now we will move on to a short Q&A. Feel free to continue to submit questions during this session. If we do not address your question that you have asked during the live presentation, we will follow you up offline by email. Martha Wilfredo, our first question here is, what is considered a small amount of low acid food? I've heard less than 10% of formulation.
This is Wilfredo. I'll take that one. The 10% was a rule of thumb that was used internally years ago. Is not something that is accepted by FDA in any way. It will essentially not work. I work with the state of California, the Food and Drug Branch, which enforces the pH control program in California, which mimics the federal regulations. And when I did work in there, we used the 10% rule as an internal rule of thumb to initiate the evaluation, but don't rely on that at all. It doesn't. And to answer your questions, to what constitute a small amount, that's at the heart of the issue with FDA. That has not been defined. It has to be discussed between you and your processing authority and make a determination, putting everything together. It's not just the amount of low acid ingredients, in my view, it's really the difficulty in getting that product to equilibrium pH. So how long does it take to equilibrate, how much of a change in pH there is, and work off that.
All right, thank you so much, Wilfredo. Our next question here is, fermented non-alcoholic beverages such as kombucha or non-alcoholic beer are on the rise. Would these be considered acidified foods if acidified foods such as lactic acid are normally a part of this recipe?
Again, if it contains low acid ingredients, even if it's fermented, the agency may still look at them as acidified food on a case-to-case basis. Unfortunately, we're also, and I know as the industry pushing to having this food excluded, but it's not clear again from an agency standpoint that they will do that. They will still look at them case by case in terms of the concentration of low acid ingredients to begin with before the fermentation occurs and so on.
Thank you again, Wilfredo. Our next question here is, are there any statistical or repeatability requirements or guidelines for the pathogen challenge studies? Is a single study necessary or some confidence interval?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we try to have multiple replicates, so that NAC math guidance as well as Fred Bright recommend at least 3 replicates for each sampling time, each product, each pathogen. And you don't necessarily have to do multiple studies as long as you're testing the worst case scenario. So that's why we put so much work up front to make sure that we are using a representative process that's at the worst case scenario formulation parameters.
All right, thank you, Martha. Our next question here is, I have a large number of similar cold-filled products. Do I have to conduct challenge studies for all of them?
Yeah, so this kind of dovetails on the last question. You do not have to do studies for all of them as long as we can group them together and determine the worst case. Ahead of a study request like this, what I would normally request would be information about each of the SKUs or formulations so that we can look at all of them as a whole and determine if there is a way that we can group them that makes sense, and then a way that we could cut down on the number of studies.
All right, thank you again, Martha. Our next question here is, are dressings and sauces excluded from the acidified food regulations? It was my understanding that they were excluded.
The answer to that is no, they're not excluded. They're subjected to the same criteria of a small amount of low acid food and a insignificant change in pH as other products. So they're not excluded just by virtue of their of the category of, being a sauce or being a dressing, for example.
Thank you, Wilfredo. Another question we have here is, can I use information available in the scientific literature instead of conducting a challenge study?
Yeah, so this is definitely possible if your product matches what was used in the literature. So for example, Fred Bright has other publications in the public domain that were used with pickle juice. So high levels of acetic acid and different levels of sorbate and benzoate. And so if your product has a composition that matches that acid profile and has the preservatives in the same levels, you could refer to that data. However, if your product is, say, citric acid based, then I would say that the results could not apply, just because the organisms behave so differently with different acidulant profiles.
Thank you again, Martha. Due to time, we're going to answer one more question here. So our last question for this webinar is going to be, do I have to control the temperature of my product during the hold period after filling a cold fill and hold process?
Yes, the issue here with and Martha made reference to this is how cold your warehouse gets during the cold months of the year. For example, if you do a challenge study at 25 degrees C, but your warehouse reaches below 25, let's say 20, 15 degrees C during the winter months, the results or validation may not truly reflect the worst case scenario. These microorganisms linger longer at the lower temperatures than in the acidic environment. So it's important to account for that during the challenge study design.
All right, thank you, Wilfredo. All right, that's going to wrap up our Q&A session for today. Thank you again, Wilfredo and Martha. Your presentation was wonderful. I want to thank everyone again for attending today's webinar. Also, a recording of this webinar, along with a copy of the slides, will be available within 3 business days. Thank you for your expertise and presentation today. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.